There was some talk about an ethnic weapon project I was working on that was called Black Bomb.
That was great, yeah. That was the most fun I've had in my life.
Imagine a doctor trained to save lives, being paid to end them. Not in secret, but as part of an official government program. What was created didn't just eliminate people, it erased the evidence they were ever targeted. This isn't fiction. This happened, and the person behind it walked free. For years, it operated in the shadows, protected by the system meant to uphold the law. And when it finally came to light, the truth was worse than anyone expected. Stay with me, because this is one of the darkest stories most people have never heard. To understand what this man became, you have to understand the country that built him, South Africa. The 1970s, a nation legally divided by the color of skin. Under apartheid, Black South Africans were controlled from birth, where they could live, where they could work, where they were allowed to exist. They couldn't vote, couldn't own land in most of the country, couldn't share the same public spaces as white citizens. And if they resisted, if they protested, organized, or demanded freedom, the state responded with force, with prisons, and sometimes with disappearance. By the late 1970s, something began to change. Resistance was growing. The African National Congress was gaining strength, and pressure from the outside world was building. The government was losing control. They could arrest people, they could silence individuals, but they couldn't stop the movement itself. And that's when the strategy changed. Not louder, not more visible, more controlled. In the corridors of power, a different kind of solution began to take shape. They needed something else, and they found him. His name was Wouter Basson. Born in 1950, raised in South Africa at the height of apartheid. He trained as a cardiologist, a doctor trusted with the human heart. By every external measure, he was exactly what the system rewarded. Educated, disciplined, ambitious. He joined the South African Defence Force and rose quickly. Not because he was loud, but because he was precise, reliable, and trusted, completely aligned with the ideology of the state he served. By the late 1970s, he had caught the attention of powerful figures inside the military. Men who weren't looking for soldiers. They were looking for something far more useful. Someone with medical expertise, scientific intelligence, and the ability to operate without hesitation, without questions, without limits. Basson fit perfectly. In 1981, he was called in, given a briefing that almost no one outside the inner circle would ever hear. And then he was given a choice. Walk away and nothing happens. Or step forward and take control of something that did not officially exist. He said yes. They called it Project Coast. On paper, it was described as a defensive research program. Chemical and biological weapons developed to protect South Africa from external threats. That was the official version. It wasn't true. In reality, Project Coast was designed for something else entirely. Not defense, but elimination. Its true purpose, approved at the highest levels of government, was to develop substances that could be used against specific targets, quietly, precisely, without leaving evidence behind. And Basson was placed in charge of all of it. He was given a facility. hidden in plain sight outside Johannesburg, a network of front companies to fund it, and a hand-picked team of scientists and medical professionals, people who were well paid and expected not to ask questions. At its peak, the program employed over 200 scientists, hundreds of educated professionals working inside a system built to create weapons that could kill without detection. Basson answered to the highest levels of the military and ultimately the government itself. He had funding, he had resources, but more than that, he had protection. An unspoken understanding that whatever happened inside that program would never be questioned. And for years, it wasn't. What came out of Project Coast was far more sophisticated than anyone expected. One of those substances was engineered to mimic natural death. Administered in the right dosage, the victim wouldn't appear poisoned. It would look like a heart attack. Natural causes. Case closed. And people started dying. Activists, healthy individuals, collapsing without warning. No evidence, no explanation. Families buried them believing it was illness, something natural. They never knew the cause had been manufactured. Project Coast also developed delivery systems, ways to turn ordinary objects into weapons, items that wouldn't raise suspicion, objects that could be carried, handed over, and used without warning. Everyday things that weren't what they seemed. And then the scope expanded. Plans were developed to contaminate water supplies, not for warfare against another country, but within South Africa itself. Entire communities exposed without their knowledge. And in some cases, the goal wasn't immediate death, it was control. There were documented efforts to introduce substances into water systems intended to affect birth rates, quietly, a population altered without ever being told. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was structured, approved, funded, and carried out under the authority of the state. Of everything that came out of Project Coast, nothing is more disturbing than what investigators would later call the death flights. Political prisoners, men and women detained without trial, held under laws that allowed the state to imprison them indefinitely, without charge, without legal representation, without anyone knowing where they were. They were brought in and they were sedated. Not with standard drugs, but with compounds developed inside Project Coast, enough to render a person completely unconscious, alive, but unable to resist. While they were unconscious, they were loaded onto military aircraft. The planes took off over the coast, and then they were dropped into the ocean. No records, just disappearance. Families waited for people who never came back, asked questions that were never answered, and over time, those people became names without endings. The exact number of victims was never established. Witnesses stayed silent, and the ocean kept the rest. Project Coast wasn't operating blindly. It had targets, specific individuals identified as threats to the state, not soldiers, not armed groups. People with voices. One of them was Frank Chikane, a church leader, a public figure. His clothes were laced with a chemical agent developed inside Project Coast. He became violently ill, not once, but multiple times. Doctors couldn't explain it at first. The symptoms didn't make sense. He survived only because the right test was eventually done. Others weren't as fortunate. There were lists, names marked as threats. People like Dula Umar, a lawyer defending those targeted by the state, and even Nelson Mandela. While imprisoned, there were documented discussions about poisoning him, slowly, gradually, in a way that would look like natural illness. This wasn't speculation, it was recorded. These weren't random victims, they were the people shaping the future. Individuals who made others believe change was possible. And that's what made them dangerous. Not weapons, not violence, ideas. Project Coast existed to silence those ideas permanently and without leaving a trace. By the early 1990s, the system that had protected all of this was starting to break. The apartheid regime was losing its grip. In 1990, the government made a move no one thought possible. The African National Congress was unbanned and Nelson Mandela was released. After 27 years in prison, he walked free. And in that moment, everything changed. The end of apartheid was no longer a question. It was coming. And for Wouter Basson, that was a problem. Because everything he had done had been protected by a system that was now collapsing. And when systems collapse, their secrets don't stay buried. So Project Coast moved fast to erase. Documents were destroyed. Records disappeared. Evidence was wiped out piece by piece. Anything that could connect actions to individuals was eliminated. But not everything could be destroyed. Some records survived, some people remembered, and some had already started talking. By the early 1990s, fragments began to surface. Testimonies, names, operations that didn't officially exist. The story was starting to come together, and Project Coast was no longer a secret. It was becoming a scandal. In 1997, it finally happened. Wouter Basson was arrested, taken from his home in Pretoria. After years of operating in the shadows, he was now in the open. The charges were overwhelming, 67 counts in total: murder, conspiracy to murder, fraud, involving millions taken from the very program he controlled, drug trafficking. The same operation that developed covert poisons had also produced narcotics for distribution. The media gave him a name, Dr. Death, and for the first time, people began to speak. Survivors came forward. Former insiders testified. Documents that had escaped destruction began to form a paper trail. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had already uncovered fragments of the truth. Now, those fragments were being brought into court. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. And for the families, the ones who had lost people without answers, for the activists who had watched colleagues die without explanation, for the communities that had been targeted in silence, this felt like the moment everything would finally be acknowledged, that someone would be held accountable, that justice was finally coming. The trial began in 1999, and it didn't end quickly. It stretched on for 4 years. 4 years of evidence, documents, reports, records that had somehow survived. Piece by piece, the case against Wouter Basson was laid out. It looked overwhelming, but inside the courtroom, something wasn't right. The case was being decided by a single judge, Willie Hartzenberg. And as the trial went on, his rulings began to shift the direction of the case. Key evidence was excluded. Testimony was challenged, not on what it revealed, but on technicalities. And then came the turning point. The defense argued that many of the alleged crimes had taken place outside South Africa's borders, and because of that, the court had no jurisdiction. One by one, the charges began to fall, not because they had been disproven, but because they could no longer be considered.
Happy with the proceedings?
So far, yes, thank you.
Are you having a better sleep tonight?
I hope so.
The people who had waited years for this moment watched it happen. Witnesses who had come forward believing this was their chance to be heard, and slowly, that belief began to collapse. The rulings continued. The charges continued to disappear. Until in April 2002, after 4 years of proceedings, the court was ready to deliver its verdict. Inside the courtroom, everything came down to one moment: the verdict. Willie Hartzenberg began to speak. Count by count, the decision was read out. Not guilty. On every charge, 67 counts: murder, conspiracy, fraud, all dismissed. Wouter Basson walked free. The reaction was immediate and global. Amnesty International condemned the verdict. Human rights organizations called it one of the most shocking miscarriages of justice in post-apartheid South Africa. The United Nations raised concerns, and legal experts questioned how so many charges could collapse on technical grounds. The case was appealed to the Constitutional Court, and in 2005, the court found serious flaws in how the trial had been handled. A retrial was ordered, but it never happened. Not because the accusations disappeared, but because the system moved on. Delays, procedures, time, and slowly the case dissolved. Meanwhile, Wouter Basson returned to normal life. He went back to medicine, back to patients, back to a white coat. In 2013, he was briefly found guilty of professional misconduct linked to Project Coast. His medical license was suspended. He appealed, and the ruling was overturned. The license was reinstated. And today, he remains a licensed cardiologist in South Africa, treating patients. Even now, decades after apartheid ended, after the trial, after the Truth and Reconciliation process, parts of Project Coast remain unclear. The exact number of people who died has never been confirmed. Estimates vary, from dozens to hundreds. The full scope of what happened at sea, the so-called death flights, remains unverified. Some testimony exists, some records survived, but much was lost or never recorded at all. The same is true for the wider program. How many communities were exposed? How many people were affected without knowing it? How far the contamination and experimentation actually went? Those answers are still incomplete, and somewhere there are still files, some in archives, some in private hands, some that may never be found. Wouter Basson has never fully explained his role in Project Coast. In interviews, he has denied wrongdoing. He has described the allegations as politically motivated, and he has maintained that he served his country.
And nothing inhumane was done. Nobody was injured, nobody got hurt, nobody was incapacitated in any way at all. Everything was done with the ultimate goal of saving lives and decreasing the loss of life and injury.
And for many of the people affected by Project Coast, there is still no closure, no full accounting, no complete truth, just questions that remain unanswered.
I'm not even interested in taking him to court and prove anything. I think he has to live with his conscience. He's a human being. I hope he still has a conscience.
The names of the people affected deserve to be remembered. The truth of what happened to them deserves to be spoken. And the systems that made it possible deserve to be questioned, not once, but continuously. This is what Vinda Files exists for, to open the cases that were never meant to stay open. Next case is already waiting, and it's no lighter than this one.